10 seconds.
Longshibeni, shall we start?
Yes, you can start now.
Yeah. Good morning to one and all. I welcome you all for the third day deliberations of International Conference on Indigenous Knowledge and Climate Change Issues, Challenges and Coping Mechanisms, hosted by Department of Folkloristic and Tribal Studies, Central State of Karnataka, Kalaburgi, India. Today we have with us Dr. He is the author of In the Shadows of Naga Insurgency, Tribes, Violence and State in Northeast India, which is published by Oxford University Press 2018, and Nagas as a Society Against Voting and Other Essay, which is published by Highlander Press in 2019, the editor of Vernacular Politics in Northeast India, Democracy, Ethnicity, professionally trained as an environmental lawyer and development communicator. He is an acclaimed grassroots convener, trainer, and facilitator with experience in Asia Pacific region in area of education, rural development, community institutions, and resource management, livelihood, policy advocacy, and initiating. Amba works directly with policymakers, NGOs, community leaders, farmers, and the poorest of the poor in mountain regions. He has extensive experience working in local, national, and international NGOs, the government, and with advanced regional policy. Germany, ICI MOD, Nepal, and FAO, Rome, Italy. So I'm very happy to welcome these two distinguished persons for our today's session. And myself, for Dr. Lakshman, I am working as an assistant professor in the Department of Social Work at Central State of Karnataka. My areas of interest are working with children and addiction. So thank you. Yes, Dr. Jalliota, kindly unmute.
Oh, hello. I'm having some internet problem, but your screen was frozen.
You have 45 minutes time for your presentation, followed by we will have discussion. Discussion will be led by Mr. Ambazin.
Thank you. Am I audible at the moment?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lakshmana, for the kind introduction, and thank you also, Mr. Amba, for joining us today. I'm having a little fever, and my voice is perhaps you can hear that in my voice, but I didn't want to cancel, so I will do what I can. What I would like to talk about today is around the theme of modern human histories, knowledges, and geographies. And I would like to start with a small disclaimer. For the past decade or so, my research and writings have been distinctly human-centered. Grounded in Northeast India and among the Highland Naga in particular, my focus was on insurgency and violence, ethnicity and identity, territory and capitalism, and other related issues in which the human was the central focus. It is not that other than human or more than humans were absent in my field notes. Ancestors, gods, deities, and spirits of many kinds, many forms, and many personalities appear and disappear in them. But in hindsight, I failed to give them the kind of prominence in my analysis they perhaps deserved. It is only very recently that I've become more attentive to other than human histories and agents. What I'm now beginning to see with more clarity than before in the context of Northeast India, but especially here in Bhutan, where I'm based at Royal Thimphu College, is the existence of cultural ontological regimes in which the human social world is part of a wider intersubjective universe. Yes? Am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you. You can go ahead. Yes.
Right. Okay. In which the human social world is part of a wider intersubjective universe that cannot be compartmentalized into distinct domains, such as society, politics, cosmos, earth, and ecology. Here instead, humans are one among many, and not the only ones who speak, think, act, and arbitrate. In its fundamental and constitutive setup, these polities exist in sharp contrast with the onto-epistemic grounding of societies afflicted with a secular and arguably sanitized political modernity, in which the person appears as a self-contained, autonomous, and determining individual acting out of rational utility on a compliant world. At risk in universalistic and normative projections of political modernity is ontological closure, arguably the gravest threat of our times. We must indeed resist this idea that a single world has become the only possibility of being, a disenchanted world presided over by humans, of popular human sovereignty, of capitalist commodification, consumption, and exploitation. In the process, closing off alternative cosmoses, alternative forms of living with supernatural agents, the animal, the plant, the earth, and any other forms of being. The implications of resisting ontological closure in our politics, and thus endorsing the Zapatista declaration that, quote, the world we want is a world in which many worlds fit, unquote, do not only concern our concept crafting and theory making. In its final evaluation, it is ethical and existential. This is the kind of context in which I would like to present my own paper today, and I would like to share my screen. Can one of the organizers confirm that my screen is visible?
Yes, perfect.
To broaden our engagement with the earth in which we live in relation to climate change, in relation to indigenous knowledge, in relation to the animal, the plants, and the supernatural forces we share and co-inhabit with, I propose in this talk to offer a few reflections on four so-called close orders, namely Yaks, Yassagumba, which is a fungi, cranes, and territorial deities. And I focus or situate my talk in the Eastern Himalaya with particular reference to Bhutan. What I will be presenting today is work in progress. And I hope none of you will mind that I'm using this talk today to share some preliminary ideas, as well as, a bit selfishly perhaps, to use it as an attempt to order my own thought. Some of what follows is based on ongoing fieldwork in the northwest of Bhutan, in a place called Lingxi, which is on the border between Bhutan and Tibet. And this is a yak herding area. And I will start with a few opening reflections on yaks and human, yak, and other relations. So for centuries, yaks have co-dwelt, co-evolved, and co-shaped the land in Bhutan with pastoralist and grassland ecosystems. Because of yaks, humans in the highlands became herders and subsequently developed relevant social organization and culture, patterns of land usage, and migratory routes. It also reflects in a cosmology whose numinous beings profess a preferential association with yaks in terms of rituals, offerings, protection, and sacrifice. The commands and the clouds of these differently manifested deities constitute a major determining condition of social life. Through the presence of yaks, moreover, humans have been enabled to sustain themselves in high altitude grasslands. Yak dung is used for cooking in a landscape largely devoid of fuels. Their produce of dairy, fur, skin, and meat allowed herders to construct tents, weave clothes and blankets, eat and drink, and to trade with neighboring populations on the Tibetan Plateau and in Bhutan's Paro and Thimphu valleys to obtain rice and other foodstuffs. Jointly, yaks and herders form a landscape that is continuously modified, where grasses grow abundantly and larger bushes and trees are trimmed. As such, the Bhutan highlands do not constitute pristine nature, the way it is popularly presented. In actuality, the highland is the result of active processes of placemaking, resulting in a deeply socialized and carefully managed landscape that has co-evolved and co-shaped with herders and yaks for centuries. From this, focusing here on co-shaping, it follows that it is insufficient in good old ethno-ecological fashion to conclude that herders possess a remarkable empirical understanding of the complex interrelations between yaks, other non-human animals, and the environment, and march through life with a clear awareness of the cosmic order. Such a characterization is insufficient because it suggests a conception of the world in which herders exist as a transcendental and separate domain, largely autonomous from non-human animals and cosmic and natural beings, who, in ethnographic reality, they conceive of and act towards as social partners and relatives, if not always necessarily on terms of conviviality and harmony. Any ethnographic theory of highland social life in Bhutan must take such intersubjective connections, or what is often called in the literature relational ontology, as the kernel and elementary and integrated schema. And this, I believe, does not only apply to Bhutan, it would also apply to other Himalayan areas. So ethnographic observation shows how in the Bhutan highlands, yak and humans recognize each other, acknowledge their responsibilities to each other, and bond in reciprocity, even as the herder-yak relationship is also one of human colonization and control. Herders nevertheless refer and defer to yak as parents, siblings, or children. They regulate their behavior to yakin through the norms of love and labor, comparable to how they would relate to human kin. You will see an example of an ethnographic quote about this in the slide in front of you. In return, yaks apply their senses and memory to distinguish between strange and familiar humans. Yaks recognize some humans as familiar to them based on the latter's gender, age, and personality traits. They cultivate unique and stable relations with each such human beings. Writing in an era when ethnography was saturated with the vocabulary of colonialism, Edward Evans Pritchard saw humans and cattle in the Sudan as parasites on each other. Marshall Sahlins' phrase, mutuality of being, offers a better way to interpret the human-yak relationship in the Bhutan highlands and across the Tibetan plateau. Yaks and humans here have shaped each other's nomadism, each other's social and political organization at the fringes of settled state society. They have jointly transformed the landscape, allowing grasses to grow abundantly while trimming larger bushes and trees. As opposed to classical models of kinship that were long incarcerated in the realms of biology and the human, here we can focus on kinship that emerges between human and non-human agents. Here we see that the social world is ever already constituted as an interspecies relationship. What we therefore need is scholarship that ultimately decentralizes the anthropos, meaning the human, in our consideration of social life, especially in the context of indigenous knowledge and in the context of the Anthropocene and climate change.
Excuse me, Dr. Jelly.
Yes.
We cannot see the transition of the PPT. So could you please, we just see the, so we just see, right. I think when you open the full screen, like the full slide, yeah, right. I'm sorry,
No, you feel free to interrupt anytime.
Okay.
I leave it at a small screen.
Right.
Are you
now,
able to?
Yeah, that works. Right. Now it works. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. In many state societies with long histories of domestication, the language of mastery has become one-sided. Humans are herdsmen and shepherds of animals. The template is then used to domesticate other humans. Humans with more power, kings and priests and warriors, claim pastoral force over those with less. The Bhutan highlands show a less asymmetrical conceptualization of pastoral authority. In local understanding, not only do yaks and humans reincarnate in each other's realms, but they also take turns in being pastors. Yak herding humans in one era and human herding yaks in another. Bhutanese humans interpret changes in yak posture as signaling recognition of other yaks and humans, as well as of the deities. Human and yak behavior towards each other shape rituals through which the territorial gods are worshipped and sacrifices are made to them. The gods are seen as reciprocating by ensuring the interdependent well-being of humans, of yaks, as well as of the lands, lakes, and streams where they both pasture. Gods, humans, and yaks thus co-create a reality that expresses their interdependence of being. At the same time, our multi-species approach should not be altogether. There is certainly the grief of the colonized, and the colonized here at this stage is the yak. And the following is a popular song composed by Abchuni Dorji in Bhutan, in which a yak is accepting in a way his fate of being slaughtered, at the same time feeling obviously very sad about it. All right, from the yaks, I would like to move on to the second entry, which is Cordyceps, which is a fungi. You see it here on the screen. So this caterpillar fungus, which is found at high elevations in Bhutan and across the Himalaya and Tibetan plateau, is known as Yatragumba, which literally means summer grass, winter warm. And this well describes this remarkable life form, which is alternately biotic and abiotic. In the winter, a healthy caterpillar will nestle itself in the roots of buckwheat and knotweed, or of sedges of milkweed. Safely cuddled against the roots of its food, the caterpillar starts to hibernate, perhaps dreaming about metamorphosing into a ghost moth that will flutter above the grasslands to mate and reproduce in what is just 3 or 5 days of its airbound and transient lifespan. The destiny of some of these larvae, however, is diverted and transformed by a fungus called Cordyceps sinensis, recently renamed as Opiocordyceps sinensis, a fungus that parasitizes these larvae, turning them into fungal hosts, and which has produced a human-oriented fungal economy. O. sinensis, as a general fungi, is an imperialist, a colonizing force that has developed the capacity to overpower the immune system of insects and plants, and indeed seems to need both to secure successful reproduction. What we witness here, then, is the coming together of plant, insects, and fungi, in a way in which the whole is more than its parts. This makes the cordyceps a contact species. At first, the fungi dines respectfully on the non-vital tissues of its guest. Gradually, however, it starts eating into the vital tissues, by the time of which the larva is moribund and starts behaving sluggishly. As a last rite of their union, Oceanesis directs the larva to crawl into a position just below the surface of the earth. You can see that in the second image here. Uninfected larvae, indeed, typically hibernate deeper in the soil than infected ones. Apparently, the fungi is able to force the infected host to situate itself near the soil surface. This is a position that is more favorable to the caterpillar, to the fungi, in a position for its fruiting, for its reproduction. As such, the host is taking the larva for one last outing before immobilizing it for good, in a way mummifying it. By the onset of spring in the Bhutan highlands and across the plateau, a fungally compromised larva is not much of an insect anymore. As in zombie lore, there is an incubation period in which the infected larva appears perfectly normal and looks like an ordinary larva. But this is deception. In fact, by now the fungus will have completely gutted the interior of the larva and replaced it with a mycelium of thread-like hyphia. Although the insect skeleton supports the illusion of a continued larval existence, by now it functions solely as a fungal food cache. Now waiting for warmer temperatures to allow the fungus to burst forth as a fruiting body right out of the larva's head. This grass-like fruiting body will then serve as a means to disperse its millions of spores, thus initiating the next hostile takeover. However, many of these fruiting bodies will not reproduce for one simple reason, which is they are harvested by humans who have found in what has now become a Yasagumba a medicine against many diseases. Yasagumba is regarded as a super tonic that stimulates the functioning of kidney, liver, heart, and lung. Another deemed benefit is restoration, in the sense that it provides energy to an organism, for instance, to speed up the recovery of patients who suffered protected illness. It is further deemed to have anti-cancer properties, as well as to stimulate sexual virility. While cordyceps have always been part of the Bhutan highland ecosystems and were occasionally collected, though not actively searched for, by herders for self-consumption, their commercial collection and auctioning is of recent origins. In the Bhutan and encouraged from the year 2004, which has created a fungus economy. It was a decision that was to change the livelihood subsistence patterns, as well as the aspirations, attitudes, and outlooks in the highlands, and drastically at that. Soon, herders started to receive what seemed to them inordinate large profits for an insect or grass that had been among them for as long as anyone could remember. What these profits are reflective of is the still escalating demand for cordyceps worldwide, but especially among urban Chinese consumers, to the extent that in Shanghai in 2018, kilograms of cordyceps were traded at prices that well exceeded the gold price. But in exploitative capitalist logic, yak herders end up only with a fraction of the prices cordyceps fetch in the markets in China and elsewhere. It has injected near unimaginable wealth into the highlands. If, in its emergence, the Yasagumba is the result of the contact between plant, insect, and fungus under the ground, above the ground, the Yasagumbu has now become a contact life form, in the sense that it brings together yak herders, the state, which try to formalize, regulate, and tax its collecting and auctioning, and the internal capitalist market, which creates demands and sets prices. In this way, the underground and overground existence of Yasagumbu is characterized by a coming together of life forms and forces. Moreover, the fungal violence from which Yasagumbu originates is only matched by the violence in social life, and stories abound in places across the Tibetan Plateau and the surrounding Himalayan highlands of conflicts and violence between collectors and the state over ownership and access to these fungus. Some of these tussles have turned lethal, as has been reported, for instance, on the Nepal-Tibet border. In the Bhutan highlands today, the fungus economy has replaced the yak economy, at least in terms of annual income that it generates. This sudden injection of wealth, however, comes at considerable social and spiritual consequences, to which we will now turn. And I start with a quote from a yak herder I interviewed. Cordyceps must be shivering in fear, because many of us are going to search for them today. Pema, a female yak herder in her late 20s, remarks as she readies herself for a day of crawling through the highlands with her eye cast on the soil in search of the caterpillar fungus. Later that day, when she finds 2 cordyceps, she murmurs a song while carefully unearthing them. Rang rang so, son jungyao. Everyone has their own difficulties in life. She is referring to the unimaginable hardship a caterpillar must be experiencing when a mushroom starts growing from its head, in the process of which the caterpillar succumbs. This small ethnographic vignette introduces us to a central ambiguity of the fungus economy, which revolves around the question whether a caterpillar is still sentient, is still a sentient being once a mushroom has sprouted from its head, and this is where the apprehension lies, whether its collection and trade and the vast wealth this has generated over the past decade and a half is ultimately rooted in sin, and thus accumulating karmic debts for those highlanders earning vastly worldly riches out of it. Science insists that it isn't, in the sense that it establishes cordyceps as deceased insects, plain and simple. Not all yak herders are so convinced about this, however. Opinions on the sentience of cordyceps are divided. In talking about this, Dorji, another Highlander, invokes the rebirth doctrine that asserts that reincarnation does not necessarily take place as another human being, but as an existence in one of the 6 gati, or realms, known as the Baba Chakra, to assert that cordyceps are sentient beings. She explains, and I quote, "Cordyceps are people who smoked in a previous life. They blew smoke from their mouths, which is sinful, and now they must atone by experiencing a mushroom growing out of their mouths." Unquote. Dorji's view is not an idiosyncratic one. The association between cordyceps and smoking is commonly and variously invoked by highlanders in Bhutan. An elderly yak herder commented, quote, "People who smoke tend to find more cordyceps compared to those who do not. This is because cordyceps themselves were cursed for smoking in their previous life as a human being." On the issues of sentience, another herder expressed thus, quote, "Collecting cordyceps is sinful, but since it gives our people a good source of income, no one wants to color the sin in public. It is said that those who collect a lot of cordyceps in this life accumulate so much negative karma that they become a cordyceps in the next life and must endure the pain of a mushroom sprouting from their heads. Other yak herders, however, insist that cordyceps are dead and that therefore their collection does not result in the accumulation of negative karma. Tinley, a yak herder of many autumns, says, quote, "Even as some people keep saying that collecting cordyceps is sinful, I do not think it is. They are already grasses when we pick them up. They die by the 3rd month of the Bhutanese calendar. There is no end to cordyceps. It's like us humans. We die and are then reborn. So do cordyceps. But even those herders who insist that cordyceps are not sentient beings allow room for ambiguity in their reasoning. It is this ambiguity that lies at the root of the ambiguity of wealth that now exists in the highlands." On the slide in front of you, you see the connection drawn by a yak herder of cordyceps in relation to the soil, in relation to the grasses, in relation to the yaks. And all of this again shows that we have to conceive of the social as well as, of course, of the landscape itself as a multi-species, multi-being world. From yaks and fungi, I would now like to turn to birds, especially to cranes. These cranes, they migrate between Tibet and Bhutan. humans and animals do not just co-evolve the world and the land on which they live, but humans also may draw lessons from animal social organization. Biologists have observed that cranes habitually form monogamous unisons that often last a lifetime. These are maintained through intimate unison calls, joint nesting, and co-parenting. Some cranes divorce, mostly on account of unsuccessful breeding attempts. In Bhutan, many folktales and songs center around love, commitment, and heartbreak among cranes. Humans regularly perform these narratives of crane relationships through their dances as well. In human narratives, cranes are clearly role models for stable marriages and sexual morality. Human sensibilities about ritual have also been reinforced by crane behavior. Across the Hindu-Buddhist world, circumambulation is a sacred movement that emulates the east to west movement of the sun. Its roots lie in ancient Indo-European ritual that shaped human migrations across Eurasia, leaving variegated legacies in South Asian as well as Roman worlds. But humans are, of course, not the only migrating animals. Birds also migrate, using the sun, much like ancient humans, to orient themselves. They also navigate with the help of physical landmarks. In Bhutan, the Pobjika Valley is the winter residence of migratory black-necked cranes. They use the mountaintop monastery as a landmark to navigate their altitude and flight pattern by circling around it multiple times before landing in that marsh valley. They repeat this during the departure to Tibet in early spring. Bhutanese notice this similarity between human and crane circumambulation around the monastery. Hence, they refer to cranes as labja, heavenly birds, believing them to be bodhisattvas, wisdom beings, a sacralized acknowledgement of crane intelligence. Human rituals, especially crane dances, have evolved to represent these convergences between human and crane movements in Bhutan. Here I must mention that this argument is part of a much larger argument that I'm currently co-writing with my colleague, Melinda Banerjee, an intellectual historian at St. Andrews. And we are writing a pamphlet that will come out in the course of next year. So from yaks to fungi to cranes, I would now like to introduce the final part of my presentation, which looks at the presence in the modern human landscape of numinous beings, territorial deities, gods, spirits, ancestors, and so on. In most of Northeast India, where I walked earlier, conversion to a large degree was an erasure. Christianity came to replace and substitute earlier belief systems. In Bhutan, this is very different. In Bhutan, conversion from earlier Bon, animistic and shamanistic systems to Tibetan Buddhism was more of a mixture, more of a hybrid. And I think this distinction is quite important to make. So in Bhutan, conversion to Tibetan Buddhism did not result in the eradicating of the moral dual authority of autochthonous deities. Instead, these deities, which pre-existed the coming of Buddhism, were incorporated into the Buddha Dharma. A central epic here is of Guru Padmasambhava, also known as Guru Rinpoche. As he traveled through Bhutanese lands, he encountered unruly spirits and deities, who were the original owners of the land and governed in an autocratic political regime over its human inhabitants. Disapproving of their politics, but recognizing their indigenous status, Guru Rinpoche did not dispossess them, but subdued and converted them to Buddhism, turning them into the sworn protectors of the Dharma, or at least most of them, as some managed to escape his sway and continued with their old ways of haunting and hurting humans. In the process, Guru Rinpoche secured the right of human inhabitation and cultivation in ways that, now over 12 centuries on, continue to shape relations between humans, non-human others, and the earth in a landscape that holds and reproduces the imprints of these contractual agreements in orature, in ritual, and in the myriad footprints and handprints of Guru Rinpoche found across the vast terrain he traveled. Tibetans focus on the mind, and animist Bon conceptions steered towards nature and spirits now combine. Most Bhutanese, but especially those influenced by Bon beliefs and practices, know that it are ultimately deities, not humans, who own and rule territories, and that its human inhabitants are very vulnerable to these invisible life forms, of which there are very many, who, if not respected, can change human life projects. These indeed are time-honored orientations that also set boundaries to humans' relations to nature, a world of sacred powers, an abode of invisible beings, the property of non-human sovereigns. Because the autochthonous spirits became intricately connected with particular places, their inclusion in Tibetan Buddhism tied religion and spiritual practice to the physical landscape in Bhutan. And again, I think so across the Tibetosphere. The Bhutanese landscape continues to be distinctly and relationally awake and conscious. In this way, the landscape significantly shapes religious beliefs, expressions, and political orientations over ownership and governance. This conviction also informs, in important part, Bhutan's constitutional mandate that preserves, at all times, 60% of its land under forest cover, as well as, in the context of capitalist incursions in the Anthropocene, is consciously emphasized and leveraged for purposes of explicit environmental protection. The quote you see on the slide by Dasho Karma Ura shows this very well, and it kind of reasserts this view that ultimately it are autochthonous deities that are the governors and rulers of the land. Now this, to be sure, is not mere philosophy or rhetoric. Even as in Bhutan, and amid capitalism's authoritative entrance, there are now conflicting imaginaries of the environment. The presence and politics of autochthonous, or perhaps even indigenous, spirits importantly shapes and influences discourses and practices of development. Here then, indigenous or autochthonous spirits continue to have a place and voice in development policy and planning. They are given official recognition and not shut out from important consultative processes that influence governance and development. Indeed, road construction or the building of other infrastructures in Bhutan generally depend on the special abdication of otherwise claimed land by deities before it may be used, traversed, tunneled, or carved away for human use. By contrast, large infrastructure projects such as hydropower dams, extensive tunneling, or the carving of the landscape by roadwalks remain illegitimate if not negotiated a priori and subject to the wrath of autochthonous deities and to which locally embodied experiences and narratives testify. This then is the grounding of politics that respects non-human owners and allows them to guide the processes of development. This is the original social contract, based on Marshall Salin's cosmic polity, rather than Hobbes and the original, rather than the kind of social contract that is popularly associated with Hobbes, which is between humans or social groups and the government. And this is also the original geopolitics. The original geopolitics is not between states, it's not between India and China. The original geopolitics is between the deities of the earth, or the currents, or the powers of the earth, and humans. What we witness in Bhutan then is a perpetual obtrusion of powerful invisibles in the domain of the political. Humans, in turn, act with considerable compliance to the moral dual determinations of these sovereign invisibles, or alternatively, defaulted and strayed at their own peril. And here I come to the final part. My training in Durkheimian thought that emphasized the important social functions of ideas and forms of religious understanding and of rituals as regenerating society had not adequately prepared me to deal with these ethnographic encounters between the yaks, between the fungi, between the cranes, but especially also with the deities. For Durkheim, indeed, the cosmos is not actually sentient and sacred truths are not actually sacred, but perceived as such by the Bhutanese or by any rich community. As such, this renders the embodied knowledge they predicate their political and ecological acts and reasoning upon as fictional and unlikely. All that is left to do for social scientists is to deconstruct their reality through exogenous conceptions and categories such as beliefs, superstitions, taboo, and myth. What this fails is to critically appreciate the presence and role of other than human agents in organizing historical and political action. In this manner, my social scientifically trained subjectivity initially took my analysis on a detour away from the central claims and convictions of my informants, and to which I'm only now slowly coming to grasp through the probing of the ontological frontiers of political modernity and imperialistic humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jolle. It was a wonderful session. I request Dr. Amba to initiate the discussion.
Thank you very much, Moderator G, and Dr. Wouters has, I think, done a wonderful job of bringing to us a topic which is really, really not just important from an academic perspective, but also important from the sense of the challenges that communities and peoples face across the world today. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you very much. I just wanted to confirm that. It's going to be an interesting challenge for me. A challenge for me because, first of all, I'm not an academician, but secondly, I'm also not an anthropologist. But I think that's where the excitement is in terms of what I aspire to do today and share with you all my understanding of what has just been shared. First of all, I think the topic very has vividly brought forth to us the importance and consequences of the indigenous ways of lives and the way indigenous communities, the way they bring forth a whole living systems in such a way that it's a symbiotic life in the context of a symbolic, culture, which includes the natural world, which includes the spiritual world, which includes the human world, and that too in a very in such a manner that each one of them is such a vital participant and co-creator of knowledge that facilitates a process of development. And he also brought in issues of development. But when we talk development in this sense, I think we need to broaden the understanding of development from not just the modern day infrastructural development to a larger understanding of what development is. And I'm so happy that you have really covered well all these issues, starting from your human-centered experiences to bringing in the issues, the case studies of the yak, the cordyceps, and then the cranes and the cosmology. I think it really brought together the essence of having to understand what indigenous of the issue of the purpose of life in most indigenous communities is about seeking life. The most basic of human motivations is about seeking life. It's not just about survival as in a modern day context, but the natural instincts of survival and self-preservation, and therefore connecting it to whether it's the yaks, whether it's the cordyceps, whether it's the cranes, and whether it's the cosmology. I think how well connected they are. And at the same time, issues of the outside forces that are there around, the threats that are there, the vulnerabilities that are there, whether it be the market forces, whether it be even a formal education system, which in a way takes away the younger generation from this value system, from this basis of our knowledge system. And I think that is where the challenge is. That is where the need for really bringing in questions in terms of how do we therefore, in one way is to appreciate it, in one way it is It may even sound romantic to many other people when we talk about all these value systems and the knowledges that exists within these communities. But at the same time, how do we ensure that this is continued? How do we ensure that this is taken forward to a new level of dialoguing, to a new level of policy making, to a new level of planning development? And I think that is where the issues has very well come out in Dr. Gile's discussions. And I'm very happy to be able to share with you certain observations. As you were talking, I also realized that the thought that came across my mind, indigenous philosophy, whether it's the Buddhist or across the world, I think is very, very broad-based. And to a casual observer, they may think that it may not even be rational, because it may not really be in line with the accepted rational thought process alone, but it incorporates so many other aspects. For example, the examples that you brought highlighted the interaction of the human and of nature, interaction of human in nature, and also the interaction of the human of how nature itself interacts with us. And this, again, I think takes us beyond the whole concept of epistemology alone, because it involves spirits of nature, it involves humans, it involves plants, animals, minerals, and so many other natural phenomena. And this is where the issue of participating with the net perspective. But I think even as for myself as a development worker, or a human community's existence is not just about the ability to make a livelihood out of. I think this is an issue that your discussion, I think, has really brought this forward in a big way. At the same time, what I like about it is you have brought forth to us the whole experience of the Buddhist community, which is a collective heritage of their experience with the natural world. And I think this can lead us to a really greater understanding in terms of what communities are going through, what communities are living, and how they're experiencing life in the newer context. Today, I think the biggest challenge for us is how to safeguard ourselves from external notions and ideas and decisions that are continue to be made for us as communities, or even for the government of Bhutan, for example. Decisions are made for them, not just by themselves, but also by the international community. Because of the Bhutanese government may themselves have to make decisions that are aligned to the international community's thinking, and not necessarily rooted alone in their cosmology and their understanding of how the community has to be doing things. And this again brings together the two forces in terms of where do we get pulls? How do we make sure that on one hand, when we're thinking development, on the other hand, how do we ensure that we are not losing what we want to maintain? And this brings together this whole challenge in terms of, for example, let me just give you a small story here. When a community loses a seed, a single seed, the loss of the seed might not be felt much immediately because they have so many other varieties of seed. Let's say a yam seed, for example, a quality of a yam. But when that yam is lost to the community, what happens is the entire practice related to growing that yam, it gets diminished. The entire knowledge related to rearing and further propagating that yam gets diminished. The entire cuisine that evolved around that yam gets diminished. The entire language that is associated with rearing that yam or growing it diminishes. So the amount of impact just because of one seat disappearing, it's so great. And I think it's Dr. Jelly's talk has really brought to us a sense of the yak herders. When you talk of the cordyceps, when we think in terms of the cranes, each of these are so interseeped into the people, interseeped into the way the community lives and thinks, and into the philosophies. What will happen next with climate change happening? Will the yak herders really be able to sustain this or not? With the amount of international trade and especially smuggling, cordyceps are being heavily smuggled across the eastern Himalayas. It's such a big issue in the international market. It's creating a lot of mafias associated with it, and so many other things that are happening around it. And this really brings to us a challenge. On one hand, so there is this communities with all their knowledge and philosophies and lived experiences and all the value systems that they have. But on the other hand, are these threats and challenges, and the whole the hypothesis of the ontological closure that you have brought in, I think is wonderful, because it is really a big challenge. I'm glad you also talked about the cosmology and the religions, because in many ways, institutional religions have failed to appreciate indigenous communities with regards to the value systems and the philosophies that they had. And I think this is a matter of great concern, sort of a revival that really needs to be coming back into our systems, because at the end of the day, as I said in the beginning, seeking life is the most basic of human motivation from an indigenous person's perspective, because at the end of the day, it's about natural instincts of survival and about self-preservation. And I think all this has really come on very strongly in your talk. The question therefore is, as there is an increase in access to education, as there's an increase to access to the outside world and to the markets, this have naturally given and risen people's aspirations, and people want to be, doing better things and living lives in a different way that they're seeing at their own places, especially for the younger generation. How, therefore, do we ensure that there is this appreciation of what their forefathers and what their elders are doing? How do we ensure that this appreciation and this life forms of a very symbiotic living system continues? How do we ensure that their connection with the land continues? Because the moment they move away from the land, they will be moving away from all these wonderful examples that you just gave us. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges in terms of the community, the younger generation, and how do we ensure that this maintains. But on the other hand, it's this whole conflict of how does development also face this when we're talking about development, especially in terms of interventions of people's livelihoods, interventions in terms of bringing them out of poverty lines, interventions in terms of giving them better education and better health systems. Sometimes I feel that bringing modern health systems, as good as it may be, has also indirectly led to the dying of the traditional healing systems. And I think there is a need to ensure that that these two are recognized and held together in such a wonderful way as it should be. And so, without much ado, I see that I have taken almost about 7 minutes already. I have 10 minutes. So I just leave you with this one question of how do we ensure that we do not romanticize the whole notion of knowledges and knowledge systems and philosophies, because at the end of the day, this is being threatened, this is diminishing. The very people who are descendants of these knowledge systems themselves are moving away from the land, themselves are getting disconnected. And that is a reality just as much as it is for me as for so many other indigenous peoples across the world. And therefore, how do we ensure that such academic understandings are translated into practical ways that facilitate and help these communities? Thank you very much for the wonderful talk, Dr. Wouters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mba Jamir. It was a good discussion. Now, Dr. Wouters invites its listeners to the Eastern Himalaya and to highland Asia beyond, to unearth the treasure of a lively landscape. It presents ontological closure as mandated by state capital as arguably the gravest threat of our times. We must indeed resist this idea that a single world has become the only possibility of being and living a disenchanted world presided over by humans, of popular sovereignty, of capitalist commodification, consumption, and exploitation, closing of alternative cosmoses, alternative forms of living with numinous beings, the animal, the plant, and the water, the earth, and any other forms of being. This talk asks us to rethink our human-centered intellectual and developmental agenda, and so in full recognition of the livingness, awakeness, agency, and the participation of the earth and other than human species. This in turn allows us to see forms of worlding in which humans are one in many and not the only one who speak, represent, and arbitrate. So, if anybody wants to ask anything, you are free. And yeah.
Dr. Lakshmana, can I briefly respond to Amba's comment?
Yes, please.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Mr. Amba. This was brilliant, and I really liked your phrase, "seeking life." It's a phrase that really stands out. I will be very brief. So I would agree with you on nearly all your points, but especially on your observation that aspirations are here a threat. So here we also have to see, where do these aspirations come from? So these aspirations are created by the same kind of exogenous forces that profit from them. This is the nexus between state and capital, right? So here, I would agree with the point that we should not romanticize it, and that even the descendants of today's generation may hold very different views. At the same time, I think we also have to emphasize that to bring into purview alternative worldviews, or to think much more deeply and much more seriously about indigenous knowledge it's not just a choice, it is really a necessity, knowing that the processes of modernity, of state and capital, have not really served us very well. They have brought us in a position where we are today. But one final point I would like to make is in relation to your point of rationality, that to some, what I've been sharing today may not appear to be rational. I think for indigenous beliefs to come to the fore much more than they do today, we have to think beyond concepts such as rationality and beliefs, but to see it as an abstraction of knowledge. In the context of Bhutan and across the wider region, if we do not talk about deities in terms of belief, which will immediately descend into a discussion of whether they exist or they do not exist, but if we focus on what they tell us to do and what not to do. So deities may tell us to eat certain food, but not to eat other kind of animals, to cut in certain places, but not to cut the trees in other places, to not break stones, or to not desecrate a particular landscape. If we see out what deities tell us to do, and if we follow, and if one would follow these instructions, these non-human beings, they actually manifest themselves as our comrades, as our compatriots in environmental preservation. So here, my final point here would be that we should elevate the discussion around indigenous knowledge from beliefs to what it actually stands for, an abstraction of deep logical knowledge. Thank you again, Mr. Amba. That was brilliant.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jolle. I thank Dr. Jolle for his wonderful session on more than human histories and knowledge in the Eastern Himalaya. I also thank Amba Zamir for his wonderful discussion. So now closing. I thank the Department of Folkloristic and Tribal Studies, Central University of Karnataka, for giving me an opportunity to moderate this session. So thank you very much, Dr. Jolle and Amba.